a couple of years ago, well, it's probably been more than a couple of years if I'm honest, I was living in Southern California and I ran a couple of half marathons. I know, it's hard to believe. I shocked myself actually. I'm not sure that I'll ever manage it again. But I did. I ran a couple of half marathons. I'm not a runner. It's not something I've done in the past or I knew a lot about. And so in the process of training, one of the things I had to do was learn about the important ways of eating to fuel my body to make sure that I could do what I needed to do. And I discovered a few things that I really, really loved and a few things that were just helpful information. One thing that I really loved is that I discovered that chocolate milk is a really great recovery drink after a long run. There's all sorts of reasons. I don't know enough sciencey words to explain it, but it's meant to help your muscles recover and all sorts of things. And so I really looked forward to the long runs on the weekends because I knew I was getting a chocolate milk at the end, which I'm not sure that's the reason you're supposed to run. But anyway, and the other really helpful thing I discovered, lots of people know about carb loading, before races, but I sort of probably, if you've not run a race, you thought, like I do, I thought, oh, am I supposed to eat a giant bowl of spaghetti in the morning? That just sounds awful. And how am I going to run 13 miles with this spaghetti bolognese bouncing around? And also I don't really like breakfast. But actually, when I did some reading, what I discovered is that if you're going to carb load, you need to do it 2 or 3 days before your race. So all your rice and pasta and potatoes, whatever other carbs, all sorts of things, you can eat them, but you need to eat them a few days before so your body is fueled and you're strong enough to run the marathon. Well, these were really helpful things because let's be honest, it would have been a really terrible sight to see me eating spaghetti first thing at 5 o'clock in the morning before I ran a half marathon through Los Angeles. I think it's a helpful thing to think about because Jesus, I think, was a master at knowing how to fuel his spirit to allow him to accomplish the things that God has called him to do. What we see in Luke, I'm guessing he did this intentionally, is we sort of see that the beginning of this chapter and the end of this chapter, we see Jesus in somewhat similar circumstances. That in both situations, he's in a solitary place. First, he's being tempted out in the wilderness on his own. And then at the end here, in sentences 42 to 44, he's on his own after pouring out, doing lots of preaching and healing and all sorts of ministry. And here he is on his own. And we learn two important things about Jesus in these spaces. The first thing that we learn is that Jesus was clear on his calling. He was clear on his purpose. In both of these situations, when he was being tempted, again and again, Satan would try to come at him, but Jesus knew, this is my purpose and I cannot give in to anything that would take me off of my purpose. And then at the end, the people come to Jesus and they say, no, don't leave us, keep doing your work here. And it would be easy, wouldn't it, to want to stay where you're wanted, to stay where you're loved, because they didn't always love Jesus. I mean, a few sentences before, they wanted to push him off a cliff, but these people loved him. So it could have been tempting, again, to want to stay. But Jesus responds to them in sentence 43. He says, I have to go because I must proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God to other towns also, because that is why I was sent. Jesus is absolutely clear on what his calling is. And because of that, the second thing that we see is that Jesus knew how to fuel that calling. He knew what his spiritual body, if you will, needed, the kind of fuel that it needed to make sure that he could go the distance. And the way that Jesus fueled himself, we saw it at the beginning of the week, right? He was dependent on the Spirit. He was saturated in the Word. And here at the end of Luke, he prioritizes prayer. He could not finish the race. He could not finish the calling that God had given him unless he fueled himself in the proper way. He could have done other things, but he would have burned out at some point. It wouldn't have worked. Just like me eating a giant bowl of spaghetti at 5 a.m. right before a 13-mile race would not have served me well. I would have gotten it wrong. And Jesus understood this. Luke tells us in chapter 24, in verse 48, that we too have a calling. He says that Jesus, one of the last things Jesus says to his disciples is, you are my witnesses. That this is our calling, and whatever it looks like. It was Luke's calling. That's why he wrote his account of Jesus's life for his friend Theophilus, and it's our calling too. That we're called to be Jesus's witnesses in whatever that looks like in our lives, that there's some way that our lives tell the story of Jesus through what we do in our jobs, through the way that we parent our children, through the way that we serve in our communities, or we love our friends or our neighbors. We are called to be witnesses in the way that we live, in the way that we speak and act. And the only way that we can fulfill that calling is if we fuel ourselves, following Jesus' example, that we fuel ourselves so that we can withstand whatever comes at us. So My question for you at the end of this week is just to ask you, how are you fueling your calling? Are you filling up on the wrong things? Or are you making space? Are you making sure that you're dependent on the Spirit, that you're saturated in the Word, and that you're prioritizing prayer in your life? Is this the way you're choosing to fuel yourself for your calling?